Good morning, good afternoon, good night. I'm Black Bright News, and today I wanted to talk about the EU citizens who have received letters to say that their post-Brexit residency rights were given in error. So let's see what the story says, because I came across this story today about some European Union citizens living in the United Kingdom who have received letters telling them that the residency rights they were granted after Brexit were given in error, and that they may no longer have a right to remain in the UK. Now, every country has immigration laws. Every country has to decide who has the legal right to enter and remain. That's part of governing a nation, and I don't think many people would dispute that. What caught my attention wasn't immigration itself, it was something much more fundamental. What happens when the government tells you that you have the right to be here? You believe it, you build your life around that decision, and years later the government writes back and says, actually, we got it wrong. If your employer offers you a permanent job, you don't spend the next 5 years wondering whether they really meant it. If your bank approves your mortgage, you move into the house. You don't keep expecting a letter saying, sorry, we've changed our minds. We trust official decisions because society depends on that trust. Otherwise, every government letter would come with an invisible warning saying, don't make any plans, we might reverse it later. Of course, governments make mistakes. Human beings work in government departments and human beings make errors. No system is perfect. The difficult question is when the government makes the mistake, how should it be put right? Government errors always seem to fall entirely on the individual who relied on the government decision in good faith. Sadly, the law and fairness don't always arrive at exactly the same place. Legally, if someone was granted a status that they were never entitled to receive, the government may well have a duty to correct that mistake. But correcting the legal position and deciding who should bear the consequences are not necessarily the same thing. Imagine someone applies honestly. They provide every document they're asked for. They answer every question truthfully. The Home Office considers the application and writes back saying your application has been approved. Most of us would think the matter was settled. Most of us wouldn't spend hundreds or thousands of pounds asking an immigration solicitor to double check whether the government had correctly interpreted its own immigration rules. Why would we? The Home Office is the expert. Citizens are entitled to rely on its decisions. That is part of the relationship between the citizen and the state. The whole story reminded me of the Windrush scandal, even though they're not the same thing. The legal circumstances are different and the history is different. However, there is one lesson from Windrush that still matters today. When the state makes a serious mistake, ordinary people shouldn't automatically carry all of the consequences, but they usually tend to. Many members of the Windrush generation had worked here, paid taxes, raised families, and lived perfectly ordinary lives, only to discover that decisions made by the authorities had placed them in impossible situations. Those with terminal illnesses found they were refused healthcare. People lost their homes, their jobs, their mental health was affected. Some were detained, some deported, and even though some of the victims were compensated, financial compensation could never replace the loss and suffering and distress those individuals experienced. One of the promises made after Windrush was that lessons would be learned, and my take on that is that fairness matters just as much as legality. For me, the important distinction is between correcting the law and managing the consequences. For example, imagine 3 different responses from the government. Response A: we made a mistake. Your status is cancelled immediately. You lose your right to work, rent and remain. You must deal with these consequences. which is what the headlines imply. Response B. We made a mistake. The law requires us to correct it, but because you relied on our decision in good faith, we will give you a pathway to remain if you meet certain conditions or sufficient time and support to regularise your position. To me, that option is fair. And then response C. We made a mistake. We cannot lawfully leave the decision unchanged, but we recognise you have suffered because of our error, so we will compensate you for the financial losses. That's similar to Windrush. Compensation doesn't always compensate for the loss, the distress, and the inconvenience, though. The problem is there does not seem to be a lawful mechanism to soften the consequences. It seems like the government is legally correct to admit we made the mistake, but unfortunately you must bear the consequences because that is what the law requires. I would ask, if the government is legally required to correct its mistake, does it also have a moral responsibility to minimise the harm caused by a mistake that was entirely its own? Because the law and morality are not always identical. The law may require the Home Office to correct an unlawful grant of status, but Parliament and government can also create policies to soften the impact through transitional arrangements, discretionary leave where the law permits it, compensation or new immigration routes, if they believe fairness requires it. This also reminded me of another story. Some of you may remember the elderly gentleman who kept receiving benefit payments from the Department of Work and Pensions that he believed were a mistake and tried to give some back. He questioned them, but the payments continued. Over time, he understandably assumed they must have been correct. He spent the money, then later he was told he had to repay it, leaving him with the debt and enormous stress. Now, I know that case isn't the same as immigration. The DWP case and the immigration cases are governed by different areas of law. Money paid in error is generally recoverable, whereas immigration status involves public law, human rights, and in these EU settlement scheme cases, the protections of the withdrawal agreement, but they do have something important in common. In both situations, the state made the initial mistake, so the principle feels familiar. The individual relied on the government's actions, yet when the mistake finally had to be corrected, the greatest burden fell on the individual. So perhaps the question isn't whether the government has the right to correct its mistakes, but whether the government also has a responsibility to minimise the harm caused by mistakes that were entirely its own. A government might conclude that the law requires it to correct an immigration decision, but it can also ask whether there is a fairer way of doing so. Can cases be reviewed individually? Can people who acted honestly be given time to regularise their position? Can there be a lawful pathway that recognises the life someone has built while relying on the government decision? Can support be offered rather than simply a demand? These are policy choices. They're choices about how a country exercises power, because justice isn't only about reaching the legally correct answer. Justice is also about how we treat people getting there. Behind every immigration file is a person, someone's husband, someone's wife, someone's parent, someone's colleague, someone who may have spent years contributing to this country in good faith because they believed the government letter meant what it said. Whatever your views on immigration, I think most of us would agree that trust matters. Government expects citizens to tell the truth, to obey the law, to provide accurate information. That's entirely reasonable. But citizens also have the right to expect that when the government makes a decision about something as important as their future, that decision has been made with the same care and diligence that the government expects of them. If trust only flows in one direction, eventually it begins to weaken. So perhaps this story isn't really about Brexit. Perhaps it's not even about immigration. Perhaps it's about something bigger. So,